I'm going to pose to you the kinds of objections that at least our public health
Yeah.
community, not everyone, I mean, there are some folks who are responsive to data, but there's a lot of ideology driving the resistance. And I'm going to name the 4 basic arguments against it.
Okay.
One is that it normalizes smoking. A lot of this concern surrounds the children. It normalizes smoking, will be a gateway to smoking. Dual use, in other words, continuing to smoke while you vape is not a good idea. And nicotine is dangerous.
Okay. Okay, so renormalizing smoking. It's never been that obvious to me why the emergence of an alternative technology to smoking somehow normalizes smoking. Surely what it does is normalize the alternative behavior, which is giving up smoking by switching to vaping. No one has ever provided any compelling evidence that this is actually this bizarre thing. When you think about it, it's a bizarre claim that you will launch a new product and actually what it does is increase sales and use of the old product. It doesn't do that. It does exactly the opposite. And there's no evidence to support it. It's just a made-up argument that has no basis in reality. And to be honest, it doesn't really have any basis in plausibility. Adverts for e-cigarettes, marketing of e-cigarettes, market e-cigarettes. They market an alternative.
The gateway?
Gateway effect. First of all, there are the people who talk about the gateway effect. When you actually say, well, what exactly do you mean by a gateway effect? What you'll get is some slightly confused or very confused often things about, well, they started on e-cigarettes and then they went to cigarettes, okay? And that means the e-cigarettes were a gateway. Doesn't mean that at all. To understand whether there was a gateway, what you have to do is imagine a world without e-cigarettes and look at all the patterns of smoking there would be. So some people never smoke, some people would smoke. And then you introduce e-cigarettes into that world and those pathways all change. So some people who smoke would switch to e-cigarettes and then maybe quit completely. And that's a gateway exit. That's a good gateway. Those are the gateways we want. So then you have to find a really harmful gateway. You have to find someone who would never have smoked, and bear in mind it's hard to know that. They have to then switch to e-cigarettes, which does them a bit of harm that they wouldn't have done to themselves otherwise. And then they have to move on and graduate to the big harm, which is smoking. So finding people that have gone down that pathway is extremely difficult. No one can really produce the people that have done that. None of the studies really do show that. And none of them are set up to do that kind of follow-up work or to measure people as they progress through these things. So what happens is that people overclaim on gateway effects. They find associations between vaping and smoking, and then they conclude that the vaping is causing the smoking. What is much more likely, though, is that the same things that incline people to smoke are the same things that incline them to vape. In other words, there are same personality characteristics that cause the two things to happen. And if they take up vaping and they would have otherwise smoked, it's a benefit to them. So I don't think there's anything in the gateway effect. And when the Royal College of Physicians looked at this and Public Health England, they said, first of all, the concept's so woolly defined it shouldn't even be used, and certainly there's no evidence to suggest it's happening on a meaningful scale.
Yeah, and the epidemiology certainly bears that out in that there are fewer and fewer teens who are smoking.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
if there were...
That's the big story. If there was a gateway effect, where are all the people who are emerging the other side of the gate? Exactly. They're not there. In fact, teenage smoking is falling to the lowest levels and at the fastest rate in history, coinciding with the rise of vaping. So it suggests that if there's a gateway, it's an exit, not an entry to smoking.
The other one was dual use.
Okay, so dual use, it's odd that people think that dual use is a bad thing. If somebody starts using a different product instead of smoking, there are a number of good things that could come out of that. first of all, if they carry on, then their risk is likely to be reduced. Some of the health effects of smoking are proportional to exposure, and therefore if you reduce your exposure...
Respiratory effects.
Yeah, exactly. And actually cancer effects as well.
But the cardiovascular, we're not so sure.
Cardiovascular, there's some doubt about whether there's non-linear effects and so on. So there may not be such a benefit there. But hell, respiratory and cancer, that's something.
It's huge.
Then there's the argument that actually you have to look at this dynamically. So if you just take a snapshot, you may be missing the fact that people are on a lengthy transition. They're going from being 100% smokers and they're gradually shifting through dual use to not smoking at all or smoking on an occasional basis. And then the final thing I think to say about dual use is it's not one thing. Somebody who vapes all the time and then, smokes a bit at the weekend when they've had a few drinks, they're not at particular risk. Occasional smoking isn't a big deal. It's daily smoking that you need to worry about. And of course, they're very different to somebody who smokes all the time and vapes every now and then when, they're not allowed to smoke. So those are two people who would both be classified as dual users, but their pattern of use is completely different, and it's meaningless to lump them together in a single category. So you need to dive into the data to understand what's going on with dual use. But it's definitely not a bad thing. It's only goodness comes from dual use, no badness.
Nicotine?
Well, nicotine has been studied extensively for many, many years in a way in which it's consumed separate to smoking. So nicotine replacement therapy, patches and gums, and smokeless tobacco, snus, for example. And it's pretty clear that nicotine is not the harmful agent. It's not completely benign, but then caffeine isn't completely benign either. Nicotine does have some effects on the body, so it changes pulse rate, it has effects on the cardiovascular system. And what people have been doing is they've been measuring those effects and going, oh look, something bad is happening. But actually that's normal. Those bad things happen when people take caffeine, when people go running, when people listen to rock music. You see physiological responses to these things, but they don't necessarily lead to people keeling over dead with heart attacks and strokes in the future.
And they tend not, in many of these studies that look at the effects of vaping, they don't compare them to cigarettes because the whole key word here is relative.
Well, the Surgeon General did a very exhaustive review of the health effects of smoking, and the conclusion of that was that the things that cause cardiovascular disease in nicotine is the products of combustion like carbon monoxide, oxides of nitrogen. They're just not present in e-cigarettes because there's no combustion. So I think they're trying to argue that nicotine is a harmful agent because it's integral to the product. You obviously can't take it out or it's no longer a substitute. But we've never heard in the past about passive nicotine exposure. We've never really had the emphasis on nicotine as the harmful agent until now. And the truth is, it's not completely benign. There may be issues for pregnant women or for teenagers, but in all circumstances, it's better to take nicotine from an e-cigarette than nicotine from a cigarette. Absolutely no question. Whether you're pregnant, whether you're 4 years old, that is always an improvement.